My name is Nicolas Nova. I come from Switzerland, and I'm going to be the moderator of this session. And I just want to give like few words of introduction about what we're going to be talking about this morning. So yesterday I arrived quite late at night at my hotel, and of course it looks unrelated to this session. But when I talked to the guy at the hotel, he was sort of in a chatty mood, almost at midnight. And when I told him that I would be in a session about the future, he told me, "Oh, I love the future. The future is great. You know why? Because that's when I'm going to be spending my life. I want to spend my life in the future." And I'm like, okay, well, that's interesting. And when he said that, afterwards, okay, but he said, but there's something that bugs me. It's the fact that I want to live in the future, but I'm not entirely sure what the future would be like and how the future would be made. And I thought that was a really interesting comment. That kind of echoes with this session, in the sense that there's a lot of interest in futures research, in designing the futures, of course, but there's some sort of misconceptions or some misunderstanding about what it means, what it's like to plan for the future, design the future, anticipate what may happen in the future, and this kind of overemphasis on the future with a capital F could be deconstructing. And I think that's what we're going to deal with in this session with the three different speakers, because there are many questions about like tomorrows and the days after tomorrows, as we've seen in the video. Many questions that should be addressed. Who owns the future? Who designed the future? What does it mean to participate in this kind of future, like production and design? And I think that would be one of the key messages that we will listen to this morning. It's the fact that we should not necessarily see the future as something falling from the skies, like a meteorite, but maybe something that could be designed and created. That's why terms like world building, futures research, futures anticipation will be used, not necessarily prediction, which is something that could be problematic for that matter. So we're going to have three different speakers, and we're going to move directly to the first one. So I invite Scott to come here. So Scott is the co-founder of Changist. I would call that a futures research consultancy, probably. It's been 10 years that I know Scott, and I saw him like evolving and changing and mutating his futures research approach. And I think it would be quite interesting to listen to his perspective, to understand more about like the tools, the intellectual tools that one can use to think about tomorrow and maybe world building and designing for the future. So join me, welcome Scott at the lectern.
Thank you. I feel as if I'm about to play a medley at the Holiday Inn. Thank you all for coming this morning, and thanks Nicolas, and thanks Impakt. So interesting times, and I think the video sort of sets up some interesting themes, and having just returned from the actual desert of the actual unreal about 24 hours ago, I'm still actually quite sandy. So I want to sort of throw some thoughts out about kind of where we are and where we may be going. The work that I do, Nicolas described it as being futures research. We're also, I guess, of a small category that you referred to as, or could refer to as, critical futurists. And that it's a kind of level, a step back in thinking about how we actually think about the future and how that changes and what forces are changing the way that the popular society and culture constructs different models of the future. And that it's really kind of undergoing a sort of weird period of reconfiguration that I think we all feel but have a difficult time actually articulating. So I want to throw out some thoughts that may help frame that discussion a little bit and talk a bit about dissent. So I was just checking the date. It's now been 7 years next month since a designer named Michael Sippy wrote a blog post on his probably WordPress or Blogger post at the time. And it sort of centered around this image. And some of you may remember vaguely seeing this kind of make its way around places like Reddit. But the gist of this image is, as you can see in the middle, there appears to be a woman. You recognize the aesthetic is Google Street View. and there appears to be a woman actually delivering a baby on the sidewalk there in the center of the image. And this is the kind of thing that as we were getting used to something like Google Street View, this new tool that was capturing what appears to be images of the world around us, but doing that through a kind of really primitive computer vision capability, all kinds of weird new kind of images of the present or the recent past are showing up around us. And the thing about this image is that when you look at it, you think, well, isn't that lucky that the Google Street View car happened to go by just as that woman was suddenly having an emergency delivery of an infant there on the sidewalk, and there were no cars in front of it, and wow, what a shot. And this started, Michael thinking and other people thinking, well, how do we actually begin to question this, whether this is a real issue or not? And he, being a good critical thinker, got out his quadrant paper and started drawing and said, well, maybe we actually can break this problem down into a sort of nice Cartesian way of analyzing the problem. That could either be a real baby and a real image from Google Street View, or this could be a real image from Google Street View, but some actors that have run out on the street dropped down just in time. They've had a nice sort of system of messengers down the road to tell them the car is coming. Drop to the ground really quickly. Here it comes. Okay, go. Action. Pretend to deliver a baby. The car goes by and takes the picture. So fake delivery, still real Google. Or they could all be fake. This could be a Photoshop trick. And now looking back, it seems so naive and so cute to think, oh, maybe that wasn't real and maybe somebody shopped it. But it could be completely just made up and circulated for what purposes, who knows. Or it could actually be a real baby and a completely made up Google Street View. And makes you think. And so in this kind of blog post, beginning to think this problem out, Sippy says at the very end, this kind of final quote, I honestly don't care which of these it really is, because even if it's a faked baby with a faked Google Street View, considering where we are now and the fact that it's circulating on social media and people are seeing it, it's still real. Something that could be completely manufactured like that, and given the kind of emergent dynamics of popular culture and social media, for all intents and purposes, it has a reality of its own, but we don't quite understand what that reality is, what the nature of it is. Of course, luckily, German Google had our back and clarified that no, people, actually, this is really, the thing that's circulating is fake. And given that we're already kind of over and kind of tired of even talking about fake news and post-truth worlds today, just 7 years ago, again, this feels like sort of happier times when we could kind of let this slide with a red flag and keep moving. But it got a number of us thinking, and by I say number of us, those of some professional colleagues and friends who were thinking about the impact that these things have on popular culture. And we started sort of working with the kind of quadrant model that Michael Sippy had set out. Some of the folks at Superflux, Tobias and Natalie, the curators of this festival. There's a long list of people who are implicated in what ultimately became informally known as the Cross-Quadrant Working Group. This group was essentially kind of assembled amongst us to try to make sense of this dynamic. Maybe if you could map it and understand the sort of taxonomy of it. And the syntax here is what it looks like it is and what it really is. So in quadrant one, for the purposes of this discussion this morning, we will assume that we're real, that you're real and I'm real. We'll just stipulate that for the next hour. And we're all here. We look like we're real and we are real. But then there are things in this kind of second quadrant that appear to be real but are actually unreal. That it might be, I don't know, a speculative design artifact that seems eerily, uncannily real, but when you actually begin to probe it and interrogate it, you find that it's just, or not just, but it is an artistic statement and not really a sort of bioreactor. Moving down, you have things like cartoons, stories, things that are intended to be fake, they're point of entertainment, and they actually are fake. But then you have this kind of weird quadrant here off to the left, and quadrant 4 of things that appear to be fake that are actually real. And this quadrant and quadrant 2 actually have some bite to them. Things that might fall into quadrant 4 might be, for example, a Russian-funded ghost army in the Ukraine that doesn't have patches and is wearing a kind of weird camouflage and is completely deniable, but at the same time is wreaking havoc to part of a country. And what's interesting about this mapping is that there are people out there who understand this and can kind of operationalize this categorization, that the ability to move carefully across the borders of this quadrant becomes something both creatively and artistically, but also culturally and really politically quite important. And so we sort of put this on the back burner, but began to categorize things that we were seeing in the real world, whether it was an entire fake Apple store in China that was selling real fake iPhones to real customers until the real government decided to really shut it down. Again, those things seem to be kind of coming slow enough that we could catch them, put them in a box, and think about what they actually represented for the future. This quote was our sort of organizing quote from the Polish futurist and author Stanislaw Lem. And I'll let you read the quote, but the great thing about this, if you know anything about Lem, is it comes from a book called A Perfect Vacuum, which is not a real book, but is reviewed by Lem and another book of fake book reviews. So there's some homework for you to go off and think about. And so these taxonomies seem to just be a way that we could begin to get a handle on what's happening in the present as a means of thinking forward about the future. And there's a futurist named Jim Dator, who's a kind of well-respected, longtime academic and head of the University of Hawaii, Manoa Futures School. And he came up with this idea of images of the future, where having looked at thousands of them across cultures for years and decades, he's basically came up with this idea that there are 4 essential images of the future, 4 generic models, that the future for us is growth. We go up from where we are today, more of this, or we go the opposite direction. The future is collapse. And these are our dystopias, our sort of dark, evil futures where everything falls apart. There's this area of discipline where coming from the present as a way of not falling either into pointless growth or fatal collapse. We maintain discipline and we move forward and a kind of steady, slow, stagnant future. Or there's this kind of magical transformation, this future of abundance and amazingness, where everything changes. We somehow wipe the slate clean and step into this beautiful new world that is everything that we want it to be. And I've been thinking about these models for quite a while and wondering, and I'll come to this point in a second, but sort of thinking about what does this mean for us now, and how do we actually, do these still pertain? Can we model some kind of thoughts about the future and images and concepts and frameworks? How do we actually kind of build worlds going forward? And thinking about, sort of what's been going on in terms of popular culture and how that sits against these kind of 4 models, in effect, we seem to be we're in a kind of narrative collapse, that things like the social contract, or if you're under 50, the way that you thought your life would be, the path you thought you might follow and get a job or have a family, or whatever the sort of tacit agreements were in society have kind of, and political contracts have become unstitched. And so the idea that we can kind of turn back into subcultures and fandoms and find safety and retreat in those spaces, again, is something that's kind of gone from being this a fringe con kind of phenomenon to we all belong to multiple protected fandoms and sort of spaces these days. And these can be it's kind of harmless or fun. They can also be different speculative histories. You probably recognize The Man in the High Castle from Philip K. Dick. For some of us, this is a great novel that was turned into an interesting TV show. But we're at a point in time where that's also kind of seen as potentially a manifesto or an encouragement or its own kind of Comic-Con for a re-emergent neo-fascist movement around the world. We have kind of weird realities that stare us in the face of, you may recognize this lady from the National Rifle Association videos that get put out on YouTube that are painting an entirely alternate picture of reality as we understand it. And from that reality, that slice of society wants to grow its own particular future. We have depictions of entire world-building kind of fictional constructs. Futures that are built around other people making other futures, or recreating historic pasts and then beginning to kind of blend the timelines. And then this is, what Silicon Valley understands and autocracies also understand is that effective world building comes from projecting whole, entire images of the future that are self-contained and aspirational. This is Elon Musk's BFR, his big fucking rocket. There's probably a big fucking robot inside. But it's, Musk isn't dumb. He may be crazy, but he's not stupid. He understands the value of projecting a whole image of a future that can be aspirational for us, but how we actually get there is anyone's guess. So I guess this is to sort of say we have all of these kind of competing things that have bubbled to the surface and are now taking, narratives that we as societies collectively, globally, have operated off of for several millennia, and breaking them with attempts at sort of injecting new narratives, but not necessarily the sort of the means of doing functional world building. And so I think of this as kind of a potentially emergent fifth image of the future of dissent, the idea that we can't get to a future if we are in complete disagreement about what constitutes the actual present. That we can't agree amongst everyone in this room exactly which quadrant we are sitting in right now and what our own collective individual realities look like. And the seepage, the kind of leakage of these tools and this kind of way of thinking about constructing realities as a kind of protective mechanism are showing up in popular culture, again, not in a PhD seminar on subcultures and storytelling and narrative, but this is the common vernacular. These are things we talk about every day. Maybe this crowd slightly more than others, but water cooler discussions in an office today involve talking about timelines and dispute of timelines. Which timeline are we on? Which timeline is the show on? I don't know. The producers want us to figure that out. The emergence of the immersive experience is a way of us kind of coming to terms with alternate realities, whether it's Punch Drunk and Sleep No More, or The Drowned Man, or when do we stop being an advertising, a kind of marketing pop-up, and start finding ourselves in an immersive experience or a kind of fake part of the universe, and we have whole universes. I now have clients we're talking to who discuss projects in the context of, well, what we actually want is an alternate universe. And that's going to be our starting point. Not we want to find a strategic pathway out of a commonly agreed present, but we want to stipulate an alternate universe, and then you need to help us build that. And that's a shift. It's an interesting difference in the way that we're actually approaching the job of futures. Or and a lot of the fantastic work that Nicolas and other people in this room have done around design fiction, the use of an artifact or an object to materialize a sort of space to suggest an everyday in another universe or another timeline. So these have become the kind of tools that we're able to use and talk about quite fluidly and frequently, to the point where you see it on the front page of newspapers, and frighteningly, it's understood and recognized by people who are actually in power. And there's a lot of world building taking place right now, competitive world building from the top down. So what do we do about that? I think it's kind of turned us from thinking that we can actually build our way out by these sort of careful branchings off of commonly agreed presence, to realizing that what we really need to do is engage ourselves and those that we work amongst in a sort of counter world building. For the time being, the only way to take down a world is with another world. and the tools of constructing those worlds in a coherent, semi-structured way that are appropriate and can be kind of fleshed out through material objects and processes and behaviors and such like, become, I think, an increasingly useful and valuable way to think about the job of imagining futures. You can't just imagine it, you actually have to take the tools up and build some kind of form of it yourself and counter-propose what that world is going to look like. So this kind of, fun, internal discussion we were having, 4 or 5 years ago becomes the beginning of a kind of strategic mapping, a way of thinking about, counter-weaponizing this kind of understanding of the territory, a way of kind of mapping the landscape, the topography, so that we can work with it or against it depending on where we stand. So it feels like, we can either kind of retreat and collapse into a comfortable, small world of our own choosing and wait it out and hope that someone else solves the problem, or we can take up the tools of world building ourselves and use that in a constructive, functional way to speculate our own realities that are positive and forward moving in such a way that we can get to the other side of where we are now. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. So we're going to follow up on this presentation on this notion of world building, which is sort of the cornerstone of futures thinking. With the next speaker, so Edwin, you can come here. So the next speaker, Edwin Gardner, is a futurist and a designer, founder of Munich, future studio based in Amsterdam, and I think he's going to introduce to his own approach and his own perspective, which is closely related to science fiction, to show you what it's like to do futures research with clients. So, join me, welcome Edwin at the lectern.
Yes, thank you. For today, I kind of focused on a question that was raised by the event. Who owns the future? Is the slideshow? Fact follows fiction and money. A crude guide to predicting the future. The future is unknown, but also inescapable. We have no choice but to relate to it. But how to do this? The future is impossible to accurately observe, measure, or calculate. We only know that the future will come forth out of the present, that the forces that shaped the past and the present will also to a degree determine the shape of the future. Yes. But the contours of human society are emergent and unpredictable and do not follow straightforward deterministic reasoning. There is, for instance, human imagination at work. So how can we approach the future in a sensible and productive way? There are many ways to approach the unknowable. At Munich, we've developed the world tree model, like a tree. A qualitative model using a historic futuristic model of modernity that we use to make future scenarios. The world tree model is basically a model of the stories that we tell each other within modernity. Another way to approach the future would be to use a quantitative model or method, like the World 3 model with a 3. The model that the Club of Rome used in 1972 to extrapolate the measurable dimensions of human civilization, like GDP, demographics, resources, pollution, etc. But there are also simpler ways to look at the future. It is more crude, but with a curious mind and an internet connection, anyone can monitor these two most powerful forces that shape our society, money and imagination. They represent power and thought, established fact and speculative fiction. Those who are able to wield these forces of money and imagination are able to shape the future. The more one is in tune with both, the more powerful of an impact one can have on the future. Was introduced by Scott, Elon Musk, a Silicon Valley entrepreneur who is disrupting the entire car and energy industry with Tesla and who's transforming the economics of spaceflight with SpaceX. He links vast amounts of money with lucid visions. Tesla embodies the dream of realizing a non-fossil fuel energy and transportation system. SpaceX has its mission to turn mankind into a multi-planetary species. This is the power of capital fused with imagination at work. The imagination of the projects of Musk are bold and inspiring and have elevated him to a cult figure with fanboys and girls, but mostly boys, that are lining up to buy whatever he sells, repeat whatever he says, and that share his big dreams. Musk's operations are proof that it is not technology that is directing the future. Technology is how ideas become manifest and how they enter physical reality. But it is imagination and funding that precedes it and that make it possible. First, an idea needs to be thought and developed before it can become real. You need time and resources to work on it, which requires money. If the technologies that drive electric cars, autonomous vehicles, and commercial spaceflight are becoming economically viable and broadly shared realities, it's because of immense amounts of human and capital resources are dedicated to these challenges. Proven technology alone is not enough. Sometimes even if large amounts of money are dedicated and the technology is working, the economics can still fail. The technology will be shelved or only accessible for the lucky few. A good example is the dream of supersonic airlines, which died not just because the Air France Concorde crashed in 2000, but mainly because of the price tag, a $5,000 ticket for a New York-London one-way trip. Technological progress is not a law of nature. It is a product of human ingenuity in an economic context. And money is not technological friendly per se. Most of the time, the economic context does not align with the novel societal visions. Just think of the financial and real estate sector. Capital is directed to become more capital and nothing happens in between. The real estate business is very R&D adverse, and Wall Street is mostly developing increasingly complex financial products that are meant to avoid risk. Thus, it is probably not a good idea to elect a real estate developer as the revolutionary avatar of the common folk. Chances are that he will work against your interest. Most human ingenuity and technological prowess is directed to the project of multiplying money and not the reshaping of society for the better. A good example is, for instance, gentrification. What starts as students and artists moving into decrepit housing and forgotten neighborhoods ends with real estate speculation driving up the prices, forcing out everybody who was initially involved in raising the quality of living, public space, and diversity in the neighborhood. The initial value created by the pioneers is captured by the real estate developer, but it is also eventually destroyed by the same developers, since they gradually drive out the elements that made the area attractive in the first place. This brings us to the first law of money imagination dynamics. Most capital is invested in the status quo. This capital will more often than not work against change. Money that only wants to make more money also produces a massive social blind spot. It obscures the values that are hard or impossible to express in monetary terms. This failure of expressing societal value in economic terms is a huge blockade for progressive change. As long as this is the case, there are no guarantees that the future will be a nice place. Those who have power will fight to maintain it. With this in mind, the future, like the present, will probably be a mixed bag of the good, the bad, and the ugly. The imagination is, however, not to be underestimated. It is a powerful force that will always stand at the gates of those in power, ready to rattle the golden cage of its inhabitants and to shake up the worldview that upholds it. The conduit for the imagination is the mind. And the minds that direct the flows of capital are equally susceptible to the magic of the imagination, something economists haven't been able to model. Thus, when an alternative imagination starts to circulate, able to inspire a different course of action, it has the power to command the rivers of cash. Take, for instance, the fossil fuel divestment movement, which started in 2011 with students demanding their university administrations to divest their funds from fossil fuels. Today, the movement has grown into the financial mainstream. In December 2006, $5.5 trillion in assets had been divested from fossil fuels. At the same time, clean tech and renewables have become profitable. This brings us to the second law of money imagination dynamics. Money is an unreliable mistress. Established ideas and technologies will eventually always be replaced by new ideas and technologies, replacing old elites and old values with new elites and new values. Changing the world is a game of lofty ideas and murky practicalities. Walking around with no more pollution or no more climate change or no more exploitation or no more war and no more austerity on your t-shirt is not enough to make a better world happen. Proposals and alternatives are needed. Power play is needed. Money is to be lured in. Those who direct power and cash need a yes to direct their resources to. A yes that can be imagined and is, in the long term, economically viable. People need to be persuaded. It is not that those who pull the strings have a lack of imagination. It is just that their imagination has strings attached. It is tied down to consequences. It is deeply entrenched in the soil of reality and thus has a hard time to fly freely. The imagination is not just a flight of fancy. It has structure and logic. The imagination is in the form of speculative fiction, has a viral quality to it. As soon as the idea of a man on the moon or a man flying is thought, people will try to realize that image. A lot of these speculative dreams are pursued and realized. Just think of all the boys and girls that watch Star Trek and that are now engineers working at space agencies, science laboratories, and tech startups, trying to make communicators, tricorders, replicators, warp drives, holodecks, and transporters. And it's not just technological imagination. In the 1960s, Star Trek also presented a progressive image of society. They introduced a society beyond money and a black woman on the bridge of a spaceship, not as a servant, but as a lieutenant. She was part of the command team and performed the first interracial kiss on American television. So the third law of money imagination dynamics is fact follows fiction. So if you want to know what the future will bring, follow the imagination. Speculative fiction is everywhere, from pop culture to the fine arts, but especially lives and thrives in libraries, where written words evoke virtual realities in the mind's eye, conjuring up possible worlds, societies, and behaviors. It is here in this web of stories that ideas evolve, possibilities grow, worlds are created, and where readers and authors build upon each other's ideas in experiments of the imagination. Not very dissimilar from how academics build upon and reference each other's work. Where science fact investigates how the world is based on science, science fiction speculates about what the world could become based on science. If we want to get an inkling of where the future is heading, we need to understand that fact follows fiction and that we need to follow the money. When we find the place where they converge and where they contradict, we can start mapping possibilities and to extrapolate these into credible future scenarios. On a personal level, we need to identify the contradictions between how we spend our money and the futures we imagine and seek to resolve these conflicts. Futurology is about positioning yourself in the field of forces that shape the present and deciding which future you or your company wants to support or resist. Or to put it more bluntly, it is about putting your money where your imagination is, and to let the facts follow your fiction. Thank you.
Thank you, Edwin. Thanks. So with the next speaker, last speaker, Michel Kasprzak, we're going to, I think, follow up on one of the topics that Edwin mentioned, the notion of imagination and what it means to renew the imagination. The imaginary is about the future with a mix of social and technical insights. So Michelle is a writer, a curator, and scholar. She's also a PhD candidate at the Madeira Institute of Technology in Funchal, but I know she lives in Amsterdam, so she has a mixed perspective, and I think that's going to be quite interesting to see how our work relates to this notion of imagination and a role it can play in the science fiction. So, Michelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for the warm welcome. And I think this actually follows on really nicely from what you were saying, Edwin, because you were talking about imagination, and I'm going to talk about socio-technical imaginaries and artistic resistance. So perhaps putting a little grain of sand in your oyster of your diagram there. The narratives that we construct as a society about our approaches to technologies and futures radically shape just about everything, from the ways that we interact socially, to the types of businesses that are supported, and to the methods of governance that we foster. The notion of the socio-technical imaginary has been explored extensively by scholars of science and technology studies. My research looks at, in part, how our socio-technical imaginaries might be interrogated through the work of artists who work with communities. First, what's a socio-technical imaginary? This notion was developed by SDS scholar Sheila Jasanoff. She says that these phenomena are collectively held and performed visions of desirable futures, which are also animated by shared understandings of forms of social life and social order obtainable through advances in science and technology. She traces the lineage of this concept from an earlier idea of the social imaginary and cites Charles Taylor, who says, "By social imaginary, I mean the ways people imagine their social existence, how they fit together with others, how things go on between them and their fellows, the expectations that are normally met, and so on." Jasanoff knows, however, that there's a space also needed to address the material aspects of social order. She points out that science and technology is never fully accounted for in the numerous studies on social imaginaries, and cites Latour arguing that obscuring science and technology in social imaginaries is systematically conducted. So she developed the notion of the socio-technical imaginary, and she has 5 specifications for what define it. She says that these imaginaries are collective, so the belief is not just held by one lunatic. Durable, so the idea is not a passing trend. Capable of being performed, so if you're performing a kind of the socio-technical imaginary of American military supremacy, for example, you might perform that by going to an air show. Temporarily situated, needs no explanation, and culturally particular. In describing the academic evolution of this concept, and this relates back to you, Edwin, Jasanoff also states that how we think of imagination went from the idea of imagination as fantasy to imagination as organized work and practices. This is in line with how we think about creativity today. Think of the fairly recent turn of phrase, the so-called creative industries. Part of this organized work is composed of performances of statehood. These performances are frequently linked to scientific and technological achievements, and Jasanoff devotes quite some time to detailing this in her publications. These performances can also be highly localized. In one presentation I observed at NASA Ames Research Center in California, the management described their bid to position themselves as Silicon Valley's friendly front door, which, if you can find that text in this slide, that's an achievement. But though locality plays such an outsized role in these socio-technical imaginaries because of their role in protecting statehood and preserving nationalism, we often fail to look at smaller, more marginalized communities and how these imaginaries play out there. And we also neglect to acknowledge that the glories of science result from and are performed by skilled but flawed humans executing their work. These kinds of linear processes and industries, which might result in the science and engineering required to produce a high-functioning aircraft, eventually come into the hands of a pilot. And it's instinct, experience, and knowledge derived from doing that makes a pilot a good one. This is a practice that sociologist James C. Scott calls METI. Contrasting the immediacy and inherently technological in a material sense of so-called traditional knowledge, or what Scott calls METI, with high modernism's aspirations, Scott says, high modernism has needed this other, this dark twin. in order to rhetorically present itself as the antidote to backwardness. He goes on to say, the spheres of human endeavor that are the freest of contingency, guesswork, context, desire, and personal experience, and thus free of meti, hence came to be perceived as man's highest pursuits. So free of basically everything that kind of makes human life variable and interesting. In my research, I'm focusing on where artists can intervene in the creation and sustenance of socio-technical imaginaries, particularly in subaltern or remote communities, and to problematize the dismissal of meti by the proponents of high modernism. I'd like to show some work by one artist who I believe is addressing this, Madeiran artist Rigo23. Rigo works in multiple media, but is primarily known as a muralist and is a forerunner of San Francisco's Mission School. He is a political artist who develops work in strong collaboration with groups like the Black Panthers, American Native people, the Zapatista movement in Mexico, and Guarani groups in Brazil, among many others. Rigo's work is strongly grounded in participative methods. His collaborative works deal directly with the political demands of indigenous peoples, the agency of marginalized communities, and the exploitation of vulnerable communities by industrialized and powerful nations. One project, the Autonomous Intergalactic Space Program, is an interdisciplinary collaboration with over 100 weavers, seamstresses, painters, carpenters, cultural activists, and organizers in southern Chiapas, Mexico. Starting in 2009, Rigo had meetings and interviews in 5 autonomous Zapatista centers, nearby villages and towns. Eventually, the proposal to build a spaceship arose, and during its creation, a local art space was also converted into a temporary space station and planetarium. And I apologize, this image is glitched, but it kind of looks beautiful, so I left it in. The Autonomous Intergalactic Space Program was composed of sculptures, fabric works, and large paintings and murals which articulated the Zapatista community's struggle for autonomy in the face of globalization. The spaceship as a particular form ultimately gave voice to the belief that the community holds in their ability to overcome the constraints of time and space. Rigo's collaborative relationships with artists and producers in Chiapas formed the basis to articulate an ambition to have the political and cultural ideology of the Zapatista movement project into cosmic space and beyond. Another project involved working with the Guarani people and other communities clustered in villages in southeast Brazil. Rigo explains that in this diverse group, some indigenous, some descendants of runaway slaves, there were many ways of living with and on the land. Instead of applying the ethnographic lens to these people, as visitors from the US and Europe often do, Rigo introduced the Californian ideology and specifically the Ohio-class nuclear-powered submarine as an object, as the furthest thing he could imagine from their reality. But for him, as a European living at that time in San Francisco, it was extremely close to his reality, as he lived a short drive from one of Lockheed Martin's locations, which built these submarines. So he wanted to turn the lens around and hear input from his collaborators in these Brazilian villages on this absurd creation, this incredibly expensive and technologically sophisticated object, a product of a very lucrative industry which designs tools for killing and destruction to be deployed by nation states. And in the process of considering this, in collaboration with those communities, they decided to build this work. It started as a replica of an Ohio-class submarine, but the community insisted it had to be more of a response. Instead of a weapon for death, it could become a vessel of life. Where the officer's room would normally be in the submarine, they made a prayer room of the type which is normally found in Guarani villages. Though the materials are simple vegetation and mud and embroidery, this is not a naive object or meant to be read as such, and it speaks strongly to both the idea of the socio-technical imaginary and meti. It is a deliberate and nuanced response to this idea of this weapon, using the materials and craftsmanship that the collaborators possess. Rigo clarifies in a statement he made, and I'm quoting, "It's not a nostalgic project about the past or a refusal of technology. For me, it's not about that at all. This project necessitated airplanes, necessitated internet, necessitated digital technologies. All those aspects were integral to the project and in no way contradict what it is about. It's never too late, I think. There's always a possibility for healing, for survival of something that seems incredibly threatened or fragile. This experience really showed me that you can succeed at continuing existing even in very, very adverse circumstances, and that in and of itself can be a source of complete realization and satisfaction." This is an extract, I'm quoting him from a video interview that he did about the project, and if you Google this project, you can find the interview, and it's really worth a listen, so I recommend. This brings me to my practice-based research that I'm doing as a PhD candidate. I'm currently focusing my research on the Portuguese island of Madeira in the town of Camara de Lobos, specifically the Malvinas neighborhood. Locals used to be a little bit ashamed to say they were from Kamara de Lobos. I had one person anecdotally tell me they would put Funchal on their Facebook profiles instead of Kamara de Lobos. But slowly pride is increasing. Meanwhile, the social housing in Malvinas remains in desperate need of repair, although there's always a few million euro and more promises to fix it on the way. Nearby, a group of improvised homes, described as, and I quote, a favela with chickens and everything by a prominent local, was destroyed to make a public garden, and the residents moved to new accommodations without protest. On a beautiful island dependent on tourism, this remained one of the few areas relatively devoid of service for tourists, but now with the Funchal beachside overcrowded, property developers are coming in and starting to build hotels, and the worst kind of hotels, with the worst kind of tourists, the kind of all-you-can-eat, blah, blah stuff. This is a proud former fishing village, but only one artisan is left who knows how to make the traditional boats, which you can see in this image. The traditional boats also got the town in trouble with Brussels because they were the wrong shape to be classified as fishing boats by EU standards, so many boats had to be destroyed or modified. As I got to know people from there and spend time there, I became curious to think about more how could we proceed in this struggle within Portugal, within EU, within the world. I began working with the Social and Parish Center of Santa Cecilia, located in the Malvinas neighborhood. The main purpose of this social center is to promote behavior change in at-risk youth, children with manifestations of pre-delinquency or actual delinquency, aggression, alcoholism, etc. The children covered by this project are victims of neglect, ill treatment, and extreme poverty. The center runs multiple projects, including an integration and development project to combat poverty, a program called ESCUP to address digital inclusion, entrepreneurship, and empowerment of youth, and a social kitchen. The center has already served hundreds of children. Our initial workshop, which you can see the beautiful chalkboard drawing, which I conducted with my colleagues at the Madeira Institute for Technology, Sonia Matos and Simone Ashby, was intended to make the first steps in getting to know this community of youth and hold a brainstorming session with them to hear more about their hopes and concerns for their futures in Kamara de Lobos. Like many other areas, it also is experiencing a huge brain drain, and people move, according to locals, to the Canary Islands or to the UK to get jobs, but we wanted to focus the conversation around what if you stayed here. Following this initial workshop, I approached Rigo 23 to see if he would be interested in developing something with myself and my MITI colleagues and the youth of the Santa Cecilia Center. We're currently planning to develop a series of encounters for Rigo to meet the youth and for their socio-technical imaginary to be articulated and given voice. As you've seen, Rigo is a process-based artist who works with communities, and these are deep collaborations. His role in this particular context of working with the youth who take part in the programs of the Santa Cecilia Center will be to guide and co-create. The neighborhood is at a tipping point, and a creative intervention with the youth of this neighborhood is coming at an interesting moment where once again there are huge promises being made of regeneration. I'm also very curious from a personal standpoint as a curator how Rigo, as a Madeira native, will approach working on his home island. When I described this project to possible funders or partners, I described three main goals. Firstly, the empowerment of youth. The youth we're working with are identified as at risk, and the program we're developing will aspire to give them a creative space to express thoughts for their future beyond the challenges of the present. Secondly, to reframe the debate. Instead of our boats being judged the wrong size by the EU, our youth too unruly, what if our outsized dreams could reframe the debate and instead set a new tone for ambition at the extreme edge of Europe? Thirdly, long-term dialogue. We're all too aware that often art projects land like UFOs in communities and only have an impact for a moment. We intend to cultivate something different here. With this project, we want to create a series of objects and events that will be seen and shown and that the youth can revisit and build upon. But underneath all this brave talk, while I'm not afraid of failure, I'm afraid of misunderstanding. And I have to confess to you, my audience here in Utrecht, that I agonized quite a bit over how I described this community to you. I took out a few slides depicting the neighborhood itself because it felt unnecessary. I'm not embedded enough yet. I'm still a non-local, and until the work begins with Rigo, I think I remain a visitor. As I said in a recent email to Rigo, I'm also getting to grips with the contradictions in my work as a curator and researcher. I want to do this project. What is my motivation? As an outsider, what am I permitted to say or do? How should I comport myself? The problems that these kids have are not foreign to me at all. But just because I feel an understanding, I don't want that to give me a false sense of getting them before I really get to know them. These are, in a way, classic questions for curators and academics doing projects in the world outside the lab. It's difficult. Both the academy and the museum don't like dynamism, non-binaries, or ambiguity, but I do, smiley face. I said this in response to him describing his intentionally oppositional stance in certain institutional settings, where the notion of a process/practice bumps up against the idea of an object/definitive event extracted from the time-space continuum. Which brings me more or less full circle. The process-based, experience-based practice described as indispensable by James C. Scott, coming up against a painful rationality which overdetermines what is possible and what isn't. Our socio-technical imaginaries often play into the hands of this. We have to start looking elsewhere for answers and get comfortable with there being no answers. I'd like to leave you with a quote from Rigo, which I think sums up the sentiment I'm trying to express to you quite well. He says, "The making of the work is the action. The artwork also participates in a movement towards a more realistic and just global citizenship. The need is less to integrate the field of visual art and more to participate in the life of our times." Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. So Scott and Edwin, I invite you to go on the couch. Thank you all of you for this great presentation. I think it was quite intriguing to see the three different angles. We've seen some sort of tensions between the status quo that, for instance, that Edwin discussed, the tension and controversies described by Scott, and I like what Misha presented at the end, that the fact that reinvesting this kind of new social technical imaginaries to reinvent potential future it's quite hard, and it has its limits. So perhaps we're going to have a short discussion here, and we'll take questions afterwards from the room. You may have some question, but first a question for all of you. I mean, something that struck me as fascinating, maybe more in the first two presentations, is this notion that thinking about the future can require intellectual tools. We've seen quadrants, we've seen Venn diagrams, sometimes bumping into each other's. We've seen like the logic of the PhD research and practice-based research. So all of those kind of intellectual logic emerge out of the, well, very Western kind of thinking, and I was wondering if you had a perspective on, well, is that a limit? Is that a problem? Well, I guess it's a problem, but how to go beyond that kind of mental representation? Is it something that could limit our perspective to be more, I mean, global in terms of thinking about the future in an era in which that's quite important? Is that something that could still be, combined with other ways of thinking? That's something I'm really curious about from, listening to you guys. Who wants to jump?
Such a curator, thank you. I think that's a really crucial question, and that it's important to, as you kind of referenced. I mean, the modern field of futures as a kind of strategic thinking field comes out of the sort of war machines of the mid-20th century. It comes out of places like Rand and other kind of military-industrial settings, and so you inherit a kind of geometry from that and ways of thinking that assume really a very small population will do that thinking, and also often assume the outcomes. And I think in our own work, and for the last 8 or 9 years, have done a lot of teaching in non-traditional settings, certainly outside of Western cultures, and working quite hard to break down the tools and make them open enough that they can be used in other ways, or that new ones can be introduced. I always tell the students on the very first slide, on the first minute of the first day, we're going to show you some ways of doing things. If you think of a different or better way, or some other practice or some other means to do this as well as, or better, or in a way that makes the most sense for you, by all means bring it. And so I think it's really critical to find not just flat, two-dimensional or mental models for understanding how different futures can come about or evolve or critique them, but to find other modalities, physical, explore all of the senses. That's where I think the immersive issues that I was talking about earlier come in. So I think it's vital to break out of that box of mental tools that we've inherited from 4 or 5 decades ago.
Michelle, I wondered about that too, about your talk, because you showed some like technical object that have been like reconfigured or changed by the artist and the community. And what, I mean, would that be something that can appear as well with tools, with intellectual tools, and can be reappropriated and changed, or is that something else?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of aspects of this question I want to address. And the first one is following on what Scott said. I think it's also about who's around the table. And you have to change the faces around the table if you're going to get any kind of change. Because, of course, we bring our own individual baggage to every encounter. And it's like, you know, our background being trained and certain methods and models being implanted in our minds. It's hard to let those go. I mean, that's just the way it is. So it's important. I think it's not like they're like, chirpy, happy. Diversity is great, you know, like, but it really is great. It really is kind of the only thing that will stimulate your mind to become wider and more open and to listen. It's interesting that you also mentioned, you know, thinking about like how we can transform tools, because that's part of the ethos of the lab that I'm working in Madeira, the Critical Technical Practice Lab, directed by Chris Csikszentmihalyi. You know, the whole ethos of the lab is how do we look at how tools are made from the ground up so that we can build better tools that include perspectives from other people. And there are 100 examples that we've all heard, you know, at conferences like this, you know, Apple Health not measuring periods, you know, the soap dispenser that doesn't recognize a black person as human, like these kinds of things. It's like without people in a diverse group of people in the mix, these tools also become broken. And then, I mean, people have hacks and workarounds, but that's somehow not enough.
Yeah. I think it adds, like I talked about one blind spot, let's say the blind spot money has, but I think, yeah, whatever angle or framework you use to approach or imagine a future, it has blind spots. So a lot of people with like a technology or science background have a cultural blind spot. People from the humanities field, again, have a technological blind spot. People who know nothing about finance will have a money blind spot. And I think, so some fields, yeah, you can make more universal statements, and other ones it's very hard. So, for instance, what we do at MONIC, what I briefly touched on, this World Tree model, it's a cultural specific model. So we always, because yeah, you run into discussions, say, yeah, but it feels kind of normative what you're saying. So yes, it's also explicitly for Western modernity. But that's also, if you want to, what for us was we were inspired by this model the Club of Rome used, which kind of extrapolated quantitative data, but how can you extrapolate culture? How do you do that? And then you, of course, have to be specific. You cannot make universalist claims. You have to say, okay, I'm talking about the West or modernity and maybe this particular part of Europe or whatever. And then, so I think it's also important to make these conversations about, future imaginaries also culturally specific, because then I think you can also map out a wider range of forces, and also can make, I think, more intelligent claims or statements about, okay, this is the field of possibilities where in this particular place in space and time the world is moving.
It's interesting, like we're not as rational as we think we are, you know, and our blind spots are really weird. So like, for example, I was reminded the other day by somebody that like old science fiction, like Isaac Asimov and stuff like that, is like, they just really didn't think feminism was going to happen. It was like women were just going to stay home and, you know, chained to the kitchen or whatever. And, you know, and you think, okay, but that was a personal like bias. They just couldn't imagine that reality. Like that was just like, yeah, that's where women are and that's where they belong, you know, whatever. But if you were to be a true rational capitalist, you would say, well, we're going to need more workforce, worker bees to do stuff. So of course we'll give women rights because they need to work, you know, work it. We need to get more money into this economy. So we're not really, you know, personal bias actually goes a long way to describing blind spots. And I think if we look at rationally where the end point of this is, it's got some surprises to it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I think it's about time to take some questions in the room. I don't necessarily see you because there's huge lights, but okay. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and there are microphones on the different sides of the room. If you don't have questions, I have some. Oh, there's one here.
Edwin, one of your main statements was fact follows fiction. But I think, as Scott also addressed, much of our imagination is very much influenced by the world that we live in. And for instance, military industry has steered many developments that we now use, the internet, etc. So can you also turn it around? I think you can turn it around, but I would like to have your comments on to which extent the facts, the world we live in, steer our fantasies and thereby limit our imagination and how we can change that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very correct. It's of course also the other way around, and of course those who have again the resources to produce the most amazing imaginaries, yeah, they have power also in that realm. But I think it also has to do, besides having the time to actually develop an imaginary which is like, which really opposes an alternative world that can compete, let's say, as holistically with our world we're in. Yeah, you need time. It's such a complex thing, so you need time for that. But I think it also has to do with just being human. So you have, for instance, have this spacing layer diagram Stuart Brand drew. So basically kind of draws, okay, you have high speed changes like fashion, stuff happening in society, and you go down. Governance, culture, nature, and it goes slower and slower. Of course, these changes we don't see. So they, to us, they seem constant. And I think this is like one of the first blind spots to overcome. And that's why often culture is the blind spot. So all the science fiction, like Asimov, but also the Jetsons, it's a 50s family living in the 23rd century. Everything is flying. And so that's like a very common trap a lot of science fiction always falls into. It's like us with like amazing gadgets. And that's, and of course there's a good, like different, like Ursula Le Guin, or there's like great science fiction which is much more anthropological or explores the social and cultural realm of how we could do this in other ways. And yeah, I think they need bigger stages because I think that's of course much more interesting. Yeah, to oppose a world to the world we have. Yeah, it's not very common.
Do you have a comment?
Just a kind of quick follow-on to that. I think, we're seeing right now, for example, the long overdue opening or call to other voices to author fiction that can actually, because of a recognition of that if in fact we agree, and I don't think everyone agrees, but that we agree that that fiction can influence fact in that sort of direct linear way, then other voices need to be representing other realities and other kind of frames. And also, and so you see there's a kind of topical issue right now around how can we bring more of the brilliant women's voices who are writing in science fiction to the fore. I have fantastic colleagues who do this. But also, do we have to be stuck in genres? Genre is not magic. Does this have to be science fiction? And this is one of my kind of points that I come back to over and over again, that science fiction itself has its own baggage, has cultural baggage, it has kind of socio-technical complexities to it. There are other kinds of fictions that we can be working with. There are social fictions. The reason Margaret Atwood is having such a moment right now is because her sort of vision of social change and the things that could be possible are coming, suddenly seeming so much more relevant, whether it's, Handmaid's Tale or Alias Grace or kind of whatever the sort of themes that are wrapped up in that are. And I think we have to also make sure not to get stuck in just changing the faces writing science fiction, but exploring other narrative forms and other genres and other means of unpacking those ideas and getting them out where we can see what their influence might be on the realities that we have.
Well, especially if you consider that new cultural forms, like such as video games, for instance, took not necessarily the place of literature and science fiction, but have now extended this kind of cultural baggage, and by being performative, because you can interact with it, also can shape or configure or help to, make people aware of those issues. That's something that can happen too.
And for us as practitioners, we have intentionally thrown the door open to as many different narrative forms as possible. Is it an error message? Is it a chat dialogue? Is it a video game? Is it how many thousands of different cultural vehicles are there to communicate these ideas and these narratives?
Yeah, that's right. Are there any other questions? Yeah, there's two up there.
Hi, this is for Michelle. I'm just a little curious of the purpose of your time in the village that you're spending the time in the fishing village. Was it to identify the reasons for the decline or identify possible solutions for a future for the village? So if you could amplify that a little.
Yeah, my choices became, I'm working in Madeira, so it was like my research needs to be based in Madeira. So I was thinking, what could I possibly do? And I was immediately just drawn to this town, probably because it's an incredible place with an incredible history. So I just thought I want to investigate more here. What is the purpose of my research there? My actual research, this is the question every PhD student hates. The purpose of my research is to look at the techniques and methodologies that artists can bring to social innovation. So instead of looking at social innovation as this thing that just kind of happens and that Brussels tells us is a good thing to do, and I'm coming across as really anti-Brussels today, but disregard that. I'm not anyway, don't misinterpret that as anything that it isn't. But as this this thing that we all need to, and responsible innovation is this kind of new buzz thing coming out of mostly Brussels as well. But that is all fine and good. But what I'm interested in is how artists can intervene in this process. And I thought this was an ideal kind of mini laboratory to do that in. Though I say laboratory with like a kind of giving myself side eye, because I know that it's not really a laboratory at all. And it's, again, all of the things I grappled with in making this presentation, understanding that I'm working with human beings, and I'm just also a fallible human being, and so is Rigo.
But isn't it also, regarding the topic of this session, isn't it also, showing people or helping them crafting their own future, or I don't necessarily like the word empowerment, but there's this notion that the future can fall from the sky and you have to adapt to it, but it's not the case, and there are ways to take that into consideration and build and participate in a future that does not fall from Brussels.
Or from anywhere. Certainly don't drop anything on us, Brussels. But yeah, there is a kind of, as I became to get a little more familiar with for example, the Portuguese education system, not to trash it, again, I'm not trashing anybody, but, it was the idea of an art class is like tracing, or like the teacher might come and guide your hand. Like it's about getting the perfect depiction of a tree or of a landscape or of a whatever. So there's not much room in there to color outside the lines or to try to do something. You don't get to decide what the subject is. I'm just using a very basic example, but that kind of gives you a sense that's something that we don't do in art schools in Utrecht. This is kind of something that people have a lot of freedom to define, So how do you let people know, it's that's okay. Maybe your education system in some ways, especially in the art classes that are given, are really holding certain things back, but how do you open up? So it's going through how do you brainstorm? Let's build things out of cardboard. Let's build a space station in Camara de Lobos. What if there was one? And you all could train to be astronauts. What if we really act that out for a day and act like astronauts? I know it sounds bananas and maybe a little also naive and silly, but there's something more to it, and I feel like that's I've kind of done stuff like that myself to open myself to new possibilities.
But it's this kind of displacement tactic as employed by artists. Reminded of Tom Sachs, of course, about his project, is that a similar kind of logic, not the purpose, not necessarily the spaceship itself, but more what happened building the spaceship and rethinking that those technical objects could be different. That's what I got from your PhD.
Yeah.
Okay. Good PhD topic.
Thank you.
There was a question from Bastien in the back.
Yeah, in your work, you are pushing for new futures, alternative narratives, transformations. But how do you manage your responsibility in doing so? Do you have a kind of kill switch embedded in your projects or methods in case it goes wrong, or in case it's appropriated by this top-down structure that you are trying to counter in the first place?
Is that a question for each of them, or?
Yeah, for each of them. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Okay. So basically, you're asking, like, I don't know, if maybe you have a client and he's evil. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think what is more, I think a realistic depiction, or so far I've experienced it, is that you have to kind of make a distinguish. They have to distinguish between a company or an organization or an institution somebody's in and like the person. So usually, if you ask anybody, you want like a sustainable and inclusive world, like nobody will say no. So most people, like on their personal level or in their sentiment, they want like a fair, sustainable, greener, nicer world for everybody. But you really see, let's say, Brussels, or any other kind of institution or framework or structure, of course, conflicts with that, or there's resistance. And that's, so if you won't ask like a Shell employee, you want sustainable exclusiveness, yes, but this whole organization is going like in another direction. And that's, I think, often, so let's say those powerful and influential parties, they are in this economic reality, and it's also, let's say, a struggle to how to make those things work. So in a way, at least what I think, as far as I see my role in that, is that to like articulate it, to clarify the thinking, like how does this work, and if you want to be more in favor of that future, which forces do you need to align yourself with? Which forces do you need to resist? Just to understand a much broader field, and also, besides articulating what future are you in favor for, also understand who helps you with that and who resists that. So to just understand a much bigger field, because those things don't happen in isolation.
Yes. I think one of the framing of your question in a way kind of reflects a lot of the way that I think popular society thinks these kinds of roles function. And they're not wrong in the sense that there is still quite a substantial body of what I would call advocacy futurists, who are either invited in or invite themselves in to implant a particular preferred future. And that's like hiring a McKinsey consultant in to install some re-engineering or whatever it's going to be. But I think you're already beginning to hear the fact that, or the sense that in some corners this work is turning, or has turned towards putting the tools of authorship in the hands of the people that we're working with, and therefore we're not necessarily so much having to worry about you definitely need to be quite awake to what's going on in front of you. But a kill switch per se, is really kind of theirs to have. And speaking as a group that's working with in some very interesting, kind of arenas of power right now, where there is a direct ability to make substantial futures materialize quite quickly. You have to, you have to become more careful as you go at what tools you're placing out there, and also giving them an opportunity to kind of bring forth the things that the systems of power or organizational structures might be suppressing for one reason or another. And then, that it's their hands is on the pen. They're the authors of whatever they deem to be a preferable future. There are certainly circumstances, I think, where you start to walk towards, topics and futures where you think, well, I don't think I would go there. But then you have to have an intelligent conversation with them and with yourself about what your role is at that moment. And the same would go for an architect or a chemical engineer or someone designing aircraft. So.
You want to add something, Michelle?
Just one little thing. I think the idea of a kill switch makes me feel too much like God. And I think it's important to approach things with a lot more humility than that.
I'm not God, but I'm going to do the kill switch. We're going to stop this presentation, and thank you, all of you, for your insights about the speculative realities, and I wish you a good rest of the day. Thank you.